They say failing to plan is planning to fail. But when it comes to family farm transitions, sometimes even the best laid plans don't go as planned. And if this is resonating with you, if you're one of the many dairy farmers right now that are struggling with how to transition a family farming business from one generation to the next, whether we're talking about ownership, management, leadership, or even a family member that wants to exit the business, well, if those are the things that are weighing on your mind, you are not alone and you are in the right place, because that's what we'll be talking about today here on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will uplevel your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. And I'm joined today by Jay Retzer from Compeer, who is going to tell us about some of his experiences of working with dairy farm families and the conversations that they're having to transition their businesses. And now, sometimes those transitions go well, and sometimes they don't. But what we can do is we can learn from the stories that come from these experiences, see what was successful for some and what some of the failures or roadblocks were for others. And that's what I hope you take away from this conversation with Jay on this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Compeer Financial is proud to sponsor this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. Their team of dairy industry specialists proudly provide financial resources and expertise to support the next generation of America's dairy farmers. Learn more at compeer.com/dairy, and you can find all those links in our show notes. And Jay, welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for allowing me to not just sit down with you, but actually sit down at a place that you spend a lot of time in addition to your role with Compeer, and that's here at Ledge Rock Distillery. So as we get into our conversation today, we'll not only talk about the role that you play and what you've seen with family farms going through transition, but we'll also talk a little bit about your personal experience and why this subject is one that you are thinking about and is near and dear to your heart and your mind every single day. And so, Jay, just take a moment, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about your role with Compeer Financial.
Well, thanks, Peggy. So I'm part of the dairy lending team at Compeer. The name implies, we work specifically with the dairy farms here for myself in Wisconsin. I pretty much have a territory around Fond du Lac of about 2-hour radius around Fond du Lac. And the dairies that I work with tend to be anywhere from 400 to 4,000 cows. So been with the company for going on 16 years now, so I'm getting to be one of the old timers. But I've spent the last 6 years as part of the dairy lending team, which I'm very proud of. In addition to that, my wife and I own a small farm. So just like a lot of us at Compeer within the farm credit system, still have that production bug that I can't seem to get rid of. So we run about 500 acres of crops. We grow forages for our dairy neighbors, and we also grow some dry grain. In addition to that, like you mentioned, we use some of that grain here, and that we built a small distillery back in 2017 as a way to add value to our farm. And so we've got a few things going on.
Absolutely. And Jay, that's what makes you such a great resource to have this conversation with about family farm transitions and transition planning, because you are personally experienced in this from your own family and your own business, but it's also the thing that has come up time and time again in your 16 years of lending. Let's refer to that as wisdom, as the wisdom you've collected and gained from having a seat at many family farm tables as they start to have conversations, and as those conversations move through the line when it comes to what to do with ownership and management from one generation to the next. And so as a lender, you are in the seat of being a trusted advisor at that table. Where do those conversations start to come in with the families that you work with your clients when they're going through transitioning? What does your role look like in that process?
It really varies. Every single operation, as you know, is unique. Everybody's at a different place in their careers. And so just depending on the situation, my role does change a little bit. Anywhere from, hey, where do we start? Who do we talk to? And I feel it's my responsibility to be a resource for other resources, to provide those to my clients. That's the great thing about having the specialist roles, where we're so ingrained in the industry itself. You get to know who does things well and who doesn't. Maybe where I'm a little bit more comfortable referring to maybe the proper attorney to start with, or tax accountant, or so. Not that we're recommending certain people over others, but you find out who works best and who might be the best fit for your client based on our relationship with that client. In some cases, I feel like I have to become somewhat of an intermediary in the conversation. I've already walked into a team meeting, not fully expecting to run into maybe the family dynamics that are going to take place. As we talk about this, there's a lot of emotion that comes into play. It's not just financial, it's emotion. I tend to worry as much about the emotional effects on all the generations involved, all the layers involved, as much as the financial side of it, because it all comes into play. So what maybe was supposed to be a, nice professional team meeting can get a little bit heated at times. And so I'm there to maybe help guide that conversation a little bit to keep it somewhat productive. And they don't always go that way. So definitely I want to be there for the client as somebody who's going to listen, somebody who can provide some guidance. And in the end, we still care about the financial side of what's going to go down, right? As lenders, it's very important to us to understand what that next generation looks like, if there is one. Is it a terminal dairy where there is no next generation? Is there family that wants to come into it? Is there no family, but maybe some high-level managers that want some ownership? All that comes into consideration when we're making our decisions for lending requests. So I like to really relay that, how important that is to us on the financial side, to make sure that there is a good plan in place.
And Jay, you just touched on so many key components of this conversation that makes transition planning so complicated.
Yes.
And sometimes even uncomfortable. And you mentioned the financial piece, obviously, but you also mentioned the emotional side.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about legacy and family, and especially in our farming community, I grew up in a farm, you're a farmer. It's something that we hold so near and dear to our hearts, is the land and the lifestyle and the values. And that does add a layer of complexity that emotions can sometimes cloud the conversations and the business decisions. However, as you talked about, your key role is so many times, it starts off with listening,
Right.
asking the right questions, and helping to get that conversation started so that when that family is ready to move along in the process, you're able to then give them some guidance and resources on, here's your next step. But before we go to an attorney, before we get that far down the road, there are basic level conversations that can be so hard to even get started.
Right.
And that's sometimes where you come into play, even when you don't plan on it.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's always difficult when family gets involved, as far as we talk about the fair and equal. I mean, that gets brought up all the time in transition planning. What's fair and what's equal are not the same things. And so sometimes one parent maybe doesn't agree with what the other parent wants to see happen. We all worry about all of our children. We all worry about that next generation. What's going to happen to them? How do they partake if something happens to us? There's just so much to it, so many variables that go into it. And like I said, every case is unique, so we have to take it case by case for sure.
And to your point, every case is so unique. However, if you could really just draw from your experiences and lay out maybe 3 things that you have seen over the years in examples of successful transition and succession of a family farming business, what would a couple of those key things be? Any stories that come to mind that might illustrate what went well and what can the rest of us learn from those success factors?
So one that comes to mind of a success in my mind, and it's always hard to talk about success when bad things happen, right?
Yeah.
So current generation, dad passes away in a farming accident. And at a fairly young age. And the farm itself, quite honestly, was in the midst of pulling the trigger on a fairly substantial expansion, like within days. And so when this tragedy happened, the quiet thinking was, well, I wonder how they respond to this. How do the kids respond? What do they do? And they ended up moving on with their plans. And so as I kind of delved into that a little bit more, like it took time to regroup, obviously, but they did decide to move ahead, and it seems like things are going pretty well. Why did it work? Why were they able to move on? And it was the planning. So Dad started at a young age, his transition planning. So early 50s in this case. I don't know about you, but a lot of times, you think, well, you get around 60, you should start thinking about it maybe, and 70 for sure. Not that I recommend that, but in this case, he knew that his kids wanted to be involved, and he wanted them to be involved, obviously. So he started that process in his early 50s. And it wasn't just putting a plan on paper in this case. He made sure his kids went out and did the financial literacy courses and got the training for management. Sometimes I feel like we're stuck on our farms, and that's our little world, and we know how to run our farms very well. But does our next generation fully understand what it takes to run the business? And he made sure that his kids were exposed to all of that business acumen that maybe doesn't always happen. So when you ask what's important, one, don't wait too long. If you know that where you want this to go, then the sooner you start working on it, the better, for sure. As it turned out, it was just a really good plan that was put in place. He allowed his kids to take on management responsibility years ago. So when Dad's no longer there, we still have people that know how to run the operation. And that's what made that work. So it was kind of those three things, starting early, allowing the next generation to have some control, and then exposing them to the outside world of business, really.
Oh, yeah, those are three such powerful takeaways, and you just recap them so very well. And so how is this farm doing today?
Quite well, actually.
If the things hadn't been done on the front end, what do you think you would have seen happen to this expansion plan and a couple of children that wanted to come back to the farm if there hadn't been the pre-planning, the early planning, the seeking of education on the business side, and the early delegation of management responsibility? How do you think that could have been different?
It could have been really bad. I mean, maybe that expansion doesn't happen because we're froze, right? We're not sure what to do. There was none of that. It flowed. Dad was part of the plans. It's not just that Dad wanted that, but they were positioned to continue to move on. So they very well could have imploded, right?
Yeah.
And said, okay, what do we do? How do we do it? And I just love the fact that there was not that let off on the management side.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what they had to do because like you said, they were doing it. For such a, once again, terrible tragedy, it was probably the best of outcomes that we could have hoped for.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. And despite tragedy, one that was able to have a great outcome from it. And so there are times when it doesn't go that way. Are there any stories, or maybe a combination of stories, that come to mind for you that you've been able to just draw some conclusions from about things that you've just seen time and time again not go well, where there's roadblocks that come up, where maybe it's plans that stall and fail to move forward, or maybe it's just the failure to plan on the front end? What's the opposite side of these success stories that unfortunately you've probably seen, because they are common in our farming communities?
Sure. I can remember back, and this was just probably 20 years ago, but a local farm that the owner also owned some other businesses. So there's 3 generations involved here. Grandpa didn't know transition planning, didn't know estate planning, and quite honestly didn't even have a will. And I just remember the pain and suffering that family went through trying to work through the probate, all the estate issues. They had other people that didn't even know them telling them who was going to do what and how, right? So they lost control to some degree of their businesses and their farm because they had to sort through it all. And it was about a 6-year process for them to work through that. So once again, that's the extreme. I would hope most at least have a will, but that's not a transition plan, right? So it's just part of it. I know of a situation where 2 generations again, current generations getting up there in years, but just is really afraid to start the process. I don't know what else to say it. It's they know they should do it. They talk about doing it, but it doesn't get done. And what breaks my heart in all of this is the next generation is working so hard. They're really managing the farm at this point, the herd and the crops. And they're not sure what their future holds. So they're putting the sweat equity in, which is expected of them. And at this point, they're employees and they want ownership. So when we talk about being an intermediary a little bit, in this case, I can have a conversation with generation number 1, current generation ownership, and walk out the door and I run into generation number 2 and they ask what generation number 1 said. Like I said, it's heartbreaking when you see all that devotion going into the business without a clear vision as to where it's going to end up. So that's hard. That's really hard.
So a few things that you just talked about right there, the lack of a clear vision you mentioned, but you related that back in that particular example to fear of letting go from the older generation, even though that next gen coming in has already been assuming many of the roles, except for having an actual plan for how this will properly transition. And here again, how many of our listeners can relate to maybe being in that situation and being the ones that are saying, hey, Jay, what did mom and dad say when you talked to them? Right? I want to just take a moment to just normalize this whole thing, because it seems like so many family farms that I speak with, and you too, they think that maybe they're alone in these struggles and challenges. How common is it to have these bumps in the road or even an aversion to planning?
That's incredibly common. It's probably the norm. I know I was just recently in a transition planning workshop where it was said that only about 24% of farm operations today have any kind of written transition plan. So that tells you right there that there's a lot of us out there that are not there yet. Now, this is a moving target. This is an evolving process. And so what you do today might not make sense 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, as life changes. So even though we may think we have a pretty good plan in place, we got to constantly be reviewing that based on what's going on. So I don't know if we ever really get there. I don't think there's a perfect plan. So I hope nobody takes away that there is, because there isn't. It's just an evolution that has to continue along with your business as your business changes, as your family changes. It's something that you're always going to be working on. You should always be working on, but it's not easy to work on. It's easy to put off.
It is easy to put off, right? And go back to the other example you shared where there was a situation where the owner and head operator of the business passed away without a will. And so maybe just dissect that for a moment of the will versus the transition plan. Not the same thing.
Not the same thing, right?
But yet both important.
Yeah.
So would you maybe just take a moment and just help everyone that's listening understand the difference between those two things?
Sure. So to me, the transition plan is, how are we going to get the next generation or whoever, how are we going to get assets into their hands? How are we going to continue our business after we're not there, right? Or even while we are there. Transition can mean a lot of things, but when I start thinking about wills and trusts and estate plans, now those are vehicles to make that transition happen.
Those are kind of the basic things to have in place, but they're part of the bigger picture of the process. So when you are living this alongside your clients through Compeer, are there times when you often see conversations start to happen? Maybe there's that initial meeting or initial couple of meetings, and then comes to a stop. Does that happen?
I think that's probably the most common scenario. We'll meet with these other advisors and talk about what we want to do. Hopefully talk about everybody's goals, everybody's dreams, what we want to see happen. So everybody's on the same table of what we want to see happen. But once again, also the emotion comes into play, right? It to me, that's where it stops. And just one more example of a situation where 6 kids in the family, 2 are involved with the farm, right? 2 of them help build a really substantial business with mom and dad. Dad wants to get that business into the 2 boys' hands. Mom is like, I have 4 other kids that need to be taken care of. Complete standstill. We can't get past this for years to come to a resolution of how to make this work for everybody. It's easy to have that first sit down, I guess. It's hard to make the decision, and it's even harder to follow up on the decision, pull the trigger, and execute.
Oh, and you just laid out a scenario that, again, a lot of people can relate to.
Sure.
And that's where there's multiple children and some that may be hands-on involved with the business and then some that aren't.
Correct.
And so how do you help to navigate through those conversations?
Well, it's tough. Coming back to the fair and equal, we all understand what these operations are about today. If we're going to split it 6 ways and expect 2 to buy it back, it's probably terminal. It's not going to happen. And the dollars are too big in this day and age to make stuff like that happen. So we have to come up with some sort of other way of compensating our other members that aren't going to continue on with the operation and didn't help build the operation in the first place. So terrible decisions that have to be made to some degree because you want to be fair, especially when it comes to kids. So what can be done? There's vehicles that people use. There's different strategies using life insurance or other means to compensate the non-farm children. But I do everything I can to recognize or help my generations recognize who needs those assets to flow through to them in a way that they can continue the business. And it's not easy.
It's not easy. But that also speaks to the value that you bring when families start these conversations is being that person that keeps that ball rolling and keeps the conversations going, and often is found having conversations with both sides of the equation. So you've seen a lot. You've seen these times where a transition has been able to move forward and a business has been able to successfully move from one generation to the next. You've seen, unfortunately, these situations where it doesn't happen. And I think we can all relate to and also learn from the things that you shared with us. And Jay, when we talk about family farm transition, it's not just something that you see at work at Compeer. It's also something that as a farmer yourself, as you were talking about earlier, and a business owner and a father, that you personally are in the middle of right now too. So tell us just a little bit more about your own experience with transition planning and how you look at this as the person that's in that generational seat yourself.
I think that's why I'm somewhat passionate about this, because I am in the middle of it right now. So Heidi and I have 3 boys, and they're all in their early 20s now. They're all interested in actually working in our business or on our small farm. But to what degree, we're not quite sure yet. But at the moment, our oldest son, Bryce, he's our head distiller. He does all the production work here, and he also really loves to farm. So as I'm looking down the road, it's like, well, I'm not sure if the other 2, how serious they are yet, but I don't want to wait, right? I want to learn from my clients' experiences, and I want to get something on paper. Number one, to give Bryce the confidence of where his future is if he wants it to be there, that this will be there for him. But then how do we get it to him without, number one, bankrupting him or us? There's all these things we're thinking about right now. So we're real close to pulling in somewhat of a team meeting. Talk to the tax people first always. It seems like they're our first go-to. Bringing in an attorney and my lender, quite honestly. And we're just going to sit down and talk about, just communicate what everybody's goals are, and then see if we can't develop a plan to get there. Because right now I'm struggling with it, and it might be a little bit more in my case, because of the age of the boys, not knowing 100% what they want, but they're getting there. So once again, if I get hit by a truck, or something happens to Heidi and myself, I really want that set up so that it can continue if they want it to continue.
Mhm.
So that's what we're working on right now. And I feel the pain. It's no easy task.
You're taking all of your experiences from everyone else's
Pretty
situations
much.
and trying to put them into action in
yeah.
your own family.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned, Jay, right there was really initially getting everyone's wishes out on the table.
Right.
And so I want to visit that topic for a moment, because that can be a challenge in and of itself to
Right.
get the family members' true and honest desires expressed. Do you see that? Is that sometimes a challenge for people that even work alongside each other and sit down for dinner or lunch together every single day to actually talk about what they really want
Yeah.
out of life?
I think those are the people that have the hardest time
Mhm.
communicating those wishes. It's tougher when it's family, right? Because sometimes we're not afraid to say what's really on our mind. And of course that can lead to poor conversations. It can lead to emotions overflowing again. And so, yeah, we see that a lot. And I think people are afraid to have that conversation. It's just like anything else. You're afraid of what the response is going to be. So as sometimes we bury that down deep and we hope they know what we want, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. It always has to start with that sit down, in my opinion, if we can make it happen, get everybody at the table and just lay it out. Here's what I want to do with my life. Here's what I want to see happen. And it just makes everything so much more clear for the rest of us to help if we know who is expecting what.
Mm. And that conversation comes before you call the attorney.
For sure.
Comes before you bring in the whole group of advisors to sit down at the table.
If possible, but sometimes it takes the group of advisors to bring it out of everybody. That's been the case more often than not too, where, like I said, you don't know what you're walking into. It's a team meeting. And then all of a sudden it's a transition meeting. But whatever it takes to get it out on the table, I think is important.
So when you walk into those meetings, what are some of the questions that you ask that help people to articulate their vision for what they want to see in their futures, in the future of their farming business?
It just comes back to, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And how are we going to get you there? So for me, it's all about, let's lay our dreams out on the table and then work back from there to see if this makes sense or not. It's just getting everybody to be open and honest about what they want to see happen, and then building out a plan from there.
So Jay, I'm going to bring this full circle, because we were just talking about the questions that you're asking to really get that clear vision. So let's wrap that back into the examples that you shared. So in that first example of a transition that went well, even in the face of a tragedy where the leader of the family ended up passing away, but still things were able to move forward, it was because the things that you just talked about, they happened on the front end.
Correct.
It was the laying out the vision. Where do we want to see ourselves 10 years from now? Both generations.
Correct.
Being honest about that. And then with that information, you are able to collaborate with the other advisors or refer, or however things need to get done, to say, here's the way that we can get there.
Correct. Build that program.
Yeah. And then the opposite is when that conversation never happened and there wasn't even a will, or perhaps there were other things that just came up along the way. There was just never that clear vision that was expressed and the action that was taken to take those steps forward and then to keep moving. And so that's, I think, where it all kind of comes full circle. But I want to just also recap something else that you mentioned, and that is, this is a process that doesn't necessarily have an end point.
Correct.
Yeah. And so how often should the vision be revisited, as well as the vehicles and the strategy to get there?
Well, I don't know if I can put a number on it, because once again, everybody's operation is going to evolve differently. But you make a great point. I mean, all of a sudden somebody wants out wow, that can change everything, and everything has to be not necessarily rebuilt, but maybe tweaked in the program. Somebody does pass away, right? And now we got to start not from scratch, but we need to build on the plan in order to take that into account. That the plan no longer is what it was because it changed with somebody leaving. There's just a lot of different things that can drive that. So it just depends on what life does to us as to how often we need to look at it. But it's definitely something that hopefully doesn't get forgotten along the way, because we all know how fast time goes by, and we're all trying to grow our businesses, and we do. And then all of a sudden something happens, and hopefully our plan is at least basically relative to where we are in our process.
So would you say the ink is never really dry?
That's a good way to put it.
In the process?
Yeah.
And this is where, again, your expertise as an advisor and as someone who just genuinely cares about the families that you're working with and their success and their future, that becomes part of the conversations that you continue to bring up and have as you move their businesses forward. Is when do we need to revisit these plans? And if there's an expansion or a change in the business or a change in the family,
Right.
let's plant the seed to take a look and revisit that as necessary. And so, Jay, we've covered a lot of really helpful information and, more importantly, stories. I think that's what we can relate to. And again, just helping others out there understand that if they're struggling through this process, struggling through having the initial conversations or picking up a conversation, moving it forward to that finish line, so to speak, that they're not alone in that. And there are people that can help. And it's surrounding yourself with people that you can trust for some of those first conversations. And that's what you do as a lender and a trusted advisor at the table for your clients with Compeer. And so, Jay, as we wrap up today, final thoughts. What's the one thing that you want to leave a listener with if they are in that position today where they're losing sleep at night because they know this is the thing that's weighing on their minds that isn't done, maybe hasn't even started? What's the one thing that you want to leave that listener with right now?
Probably not to wait. I know it's easy to say that, and it's hard to actually execute, but bad things happen every day. Things change every day. And the longer we put it off, the better the chances are your legacy is not going to continue the way you envision it or want it to. So anything that we can do to move the process along, to get everybody on the same page, hopefully, to get something on paper so everybody knows what your wishes are, I think that's really important. So of everything I've seen, the earlier you start, the better. So that would be my advice. Do whatever you can to push through.
Well, thank you so much, Jay, for the insights that you shared, for these stories, for your expertise, and also your personal experience in this whole topic of generational transition and succession planning for family farming businesses. And once again, thank you to Compeer Financial for sponsoring this episode of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. And you can find the links to Compeer in our show notes because their team of dairy industry specialists proudly provides financial resources and expertise to support that next generation of America's dairy farms. So that link's in our show notes, or you can visit compeer.com/dairy to get connected with Jay and your team. And we'll make sure we include your direct contact in the show notes as well for those that might want to reach out to you with some of their questions, not just about lending, but about making sure that their businesses are situated to move forward for a bright future in dairy farming and in agriculture. Thanks so much for joining me, Jay.
Thanks for having me.